If the philosophies and practices which come down to us from late antiquity, informing magic, the occult, and the Western esoteric traditions were to be analogized as a kind of banquet, then Hermeticism would be thought of as at least part of the main course, and would undoubtedly be the most exotic and perhaps the most delectable dish. In this episode, we'll be taking our first bite into this essential, magical tradition. I'm Ike Baker, and this is Arcanum. Oxford defines the word Hermetic as, quote, relating to an ancient occult tradition encompassing alchemy, astrology, and theosophy, end quote. Firstly, let's discuss the term Hermeticism as opposed to Hermetism. Hermeticism is a term used to denote the broader, more modern concept of Hermetic philosophy and its applications. We see this term come more into play in describing its philosophies as interpreted and expounded during the Renaissance and modern era. Hermeticism encompasses historical Hermetic texts, but also texts which perhaps stray beyond the bounds of the academic strictures typically used to identify Hermetic studies. Hermetism, on the other hand, is an academic term, which is used to denote a strictly historical or academic discussion of the Hermetic literature and its history throughout late antiquity. We'll elaborate this further as we explore the topic in this and future episodes. The root of the word Hermeticism, or Hermetic, is the name of the Greek god Hermes, the messenger of the gods, who alone was able to traverse the three realms of creation: the Olympian or celestial realm, the earthbound or terrestrial, and the chthonic or underworld. During the Greco-Egyptian or Hellenistic cultural and religious synthesis which took place as a result of Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia and consequently of Egypt, since Egypt was at the time under Persian control, Hermes blended with the Egyptian scribal god of wisdom, Thoth, the ibis-headed, also rendered as a baboon. These gods had consonances, or harmonies, which were deemed significant, as ancient Greek peoples frequently viewed gods of foreign pantheons as having a kind of cognate relationship to their own. In fact, many of their own gods were imported from surrounding regions and cultures. Hermes and Thoth were both gods preeminently concerned with communication and language. There was an overarching basis in those things which expressed the hidden, interior contents of the mind. These two gods were hybridized into Thoth-Hermes, or Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. Many of the Hermetic works from this period were pseudonymously attributed to the figure of Hermes Trismegistus, who until fairly recently was thought to be an historic personage, even a contemporary of the Hebraic emancipator and lawgiver Moses. To thrice greatest Hermes was attributed the imparting of all arts and sciences to mankind, the archetype of the sage, teacher, proto-scientist, and magician. He was considered to be the author of a body of works now known as the Hermetica. The earliest of these are a collection of astrological treatises which date to around the 1st century BCE and possibly a century or two earlier. Now, let's venture back a bit and have a look at some ancient Egyptian ideas which predate the Hellenistic syncretism and are relevant to the philosophy and development of Hermetism. Ancient Egyptian religion was one overflowing with plurality. Clearly polytheistic until a very brief period of enforced monotheism in the Amarna period by the infamous Akhenaten, the Egyptian conception of the gods and goddesses, or Neteru, was that each not only governed a specific aspect of the material world, but whose material vehicles or bodies were conceived of as being material objects themselves. Nut, therefore, was the starry night sky. Ra was the midday sun. However, during the Middle Kingdom, and especially the New Kingdom, there are clear references to God in the singular. We find in Egyptian creation myths a singular god which is, quote, born of himself, and from which the subsequent gods are created. This god is Atum. After Atum's self-birth before all existence, he self-copulates and then creates the gods Tefnut and Shu. fire, and air respectively. Curiously, we find in Atum's name a paradox. It means both to be everything as well as not being. He is the complete all from which everything comes. Now, if you've been following this channel, this should sound distinctly familiar by now. This is the very same conception of the Neoplatonic one, Toen, the aspect of the threefold hypostatic superessential divinity, which is thought to be an empty fullness. It is both a state requiring an apophatic or negative description, yet containing everything. Atum is self-created and therefore the substantive ground of all creation. Therefore, Atum is also the other gods. He is the entirety of the cosmos. This is corroborated by the coffin text of the Middle Kingdom, wherein the text clearly delineates a threefold unity of Atum, Tefnut, and Shu. Atum says, quote, "I am Atum. When I was alone in Nun, inert, they were already with me." End quote. Further, it is stated in the coffin text that Atum, quote, "was one and became three." The ancient Egyptians also revered the god Heka, magic. Of the gods present in the retinue of Ra, the solar deity, whose bark or ship sailed through the heavens of the day and the dark underworld of the night, Heka was among the foremost. In the ancient Egyptian cosmological mythology, this placed the god Heka, magic, among those forces responsible for the generation and maintenance of the visible world. In ancient Greek thought, we observe in Pythagorean and pre-Socratic philosophy, between 600 and 500 BCE, the idea of a monad, an underlying unity from which all multiplicity arises. Fast forward to 332 BCE. Alexander and his army stand ready to invade Egypt, but the Egyptians are all too eager to greet the armies as welcome liberators from their Persian overlords. Egypt had been conquered by the Persians around 200 years earlier, and rather than ruling as pharaohs, the Persians ruled as foreigners. Relations were less than ideal. In order to both ensure the Egyptian people of a reinstatement of the pharaonic dynasty and position himself as legitimate successor to this line, Alexander visited the holy city and capital of ancient Egypt, Memphis, where he made sacrifices to the Egyptian gods, and then traveled to consult the oracle of Amun-Ra. This was effectively the beginning of the Hellenistic period. One of the first orders of business Alexander executed was the founding of the city of Alexandria. It would become a cultural and educational center of the known world and home to the great library, as well as the Neoplatonic philosophers, the early Coptic Christian and Gnostic sects, and Hermetists. After Alexander's death came the wars of the Diadochi, Alexander's generals. Ptolemaeus won control over Egypt and established the Ptolemaic dynasty, from which came prominent figures such as its founder, Ptolemy Soter, as well as Cleopatra. In 30 BCE, however, Egypt was conquered by Rome, bringing still further syncretism and characteristically Roman economic prosperity, ushering forth mass urbanization. We've looked with some detail at the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics. Now, what separates the Hermetists is their deeply rooted Egyptian influence. Yet, despite the supposed antiquity of the Hermetic writings themselves, this tradition was doubtless formed of a merger between Egyptian and Greek or Hellenistic thought. The earliest of these are a series of astrological texts and a collection of axioms pseudonymously attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, imparted by the legendary sage to none other than Asclepius. These date at the very earliest to the 1st century CE, possibly a century or two earlier, as mentioned. Among the early Neoplatonists, not much of the Hermetic texts are references. However, when Hermetism is spoken of, it is with respect, and with the recognition that these were not mere philosophies of another ilk, but rather traditions of the ancient Egyptian priest class. In fact, Iamblichus explains in his On the Mysteries that the rites of the Chaldeans, particularly the Egyptians, are proper rituals of elevation, and that these ceremonies and ritual forms were indeed the component missing from what he considered to be characteristically Greek hyper-rationalism. His remedy for this, and key ingredient for ascension in his system of theurgy, was the trans-rational states achieved by way of the old Egyptian rites. Plutarch also refers to quote-unquote thrice greatest Hermes in the 1st century CE. Among Gnosticism, as with Platonism, we see many similarities or consonances. These three all espouse a belief in a monad, or an ultimate absolute being which is one, subsistent of itself, from which all multiplicity, variety, and permutation come forth. Church fathers, themselves significantly influenced by Neoplatonism, such as Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, make mention of Hermetic literature as treating of the Egyptian religion. We may stop here for a moment and recall the ancient Egyptian creation myth involving the birthing of Atum, the empty fullness of himself, and the trinity of gods which enact the creation of the physical cosmos. We find a similar idea in the Neoplatonic three hypostases: the one, Tohen, intellect or nous, and the world soul or psyche, psychikosmo. In early Christianities, including Gnosticism, we find the trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Particularly in Gnosticism, Sophia was held to represent the Holy Spirit. In Hermetism, we find reference to the One as the Father, and while there is debate as to a specific or particular Hermetic trinity, we curiously find Hermes referred to as thrice great. We also find Hermetic texts, such as the Asclepius and Discourse on the 8th and 9th, in the Nag Hammadi codices, which are primarily a collection of early Christian Gnostic literature written in Coptic and found near Alexandria, Egypt. But what of the Hermetic literature itself? Well, we can safely say that Hermetism comes from a body of work called the Hermetica. These are the teachings and writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. These are typically divided into two categories: the theoretical, or philosophical, and practical, or technical Hermetica. The theoretical being discursive, philosophical texts, and the practical being concerned with magic, astrology, and alchemy. Although they are grouped as such in the modern day, there is nothing to suggest such a distinction to be known in late antiquity. We find that Egyptian religio-philosophical currents of any variety were not generally averse to magical ceremony. This is an important note regarding the characterization of Egyptian traditions and practical magic. Heka. As an aside of interest to brethren of the craft, the Dutch theologian and historian Gilles Quispel has said, quote, "It is now completely certain that there existed before and after the beginning of the Christian era in Alexandria a secret society, akin to a Masonic lodge. The members of this group called themselves Brethren, were initiated through a baptism of the Spirit, greeted each other with a sacred kiss, celebrated a sacred meal, and read the Hermetic writings as edifying treatises for their spiritual progress." End quote. A smaller collection or group of literature within the overarching Hermetica is famously referred to as the Corpus Hermeticum, consisting of 17 Greek treatises, originally being written between 100 and 300 CE and later compiled by medieval Byzantine scholars. Of these treatises, a text referred to as Poimandros, or the Pymander, is the first and among the most well-known and significant Hermetic documents. The figure of Poimandros in this text is conceived as being the divine mind, or nous. The issue with parsing the significant figures of early Hermetism is that the literature is pseudonymously attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, effectively obscuring the identity of any number of philosophical luminaries within the tradition from this time. Iamblichus writes, quote, "Hermes, the deity who presides over rational discourses, has long and rightly been considered common to all who practice the sacred arts. He who presides over true science concerning gods is one and the same throughout the universe. It is to him that our ancestors dedicated the discoveries of their wisdom, attributing all their own writings to Hermes." End quote. One figure which we can point to within the Hermetic tradition is the figure of Zosimos of Panopolis. Zosimos, an Egyptian scribe priest, specialized in the record-keeping of Egyptian metal-dyeing procedures in the 4th century. While the Egyptian priest class was stratified into a kind of micro-society of scribes, physicians, metallurgists, astronomers, botanists, and many other things, they all had one thing in common. They were priests, and therefore would have had to undergo some sort of training, or special ability, common to the knowledge and duties of such a class. Therefore, in Zosimos' writings, we see an incredible ability to interpret and synthesize all of the traditions of his place and time, including alchemy, theurgy, natural magic, divine cosmogony, vision work, Christian soteriology, Gnostic references, and imagery which is seen echoed in even later periods throughout the degrees of Masonry. We've mentioned more about Zosimos in the Hermetic alchemical tradition in our series on alchemy. Another early collector of Hermetic manuscripts was Hermes Stobaeus, who lived in Stobi, Macedonia during the 5th century. Among these, which we inherit today, are the Stobaean extracts, which are a series of extracts from earlier Hellenistic authors, particularly focusing on magical and astrological techniques imparted by Hermes Trismegistus. Suffice it to say that Hermetism in general encompassed an extremely broad swath of what we consider today as magic and the occult generally. Hermetism is the root of many modern magical traditions and philosophies because it's so heavily incorporated a magical view of the universe, not merely extrapolated from dense philosophical texts, but animated by an ancient Egyptian cosmological worldview which was dependent upon all kinds of ritual for its expression, as well as human participation in cosmic processes. Many of these Hermetic texts take the form of an older, wiser, perhaps divine being or guide, giving a lecture, explanation, or discourse on certain arcane spiritual subjects to either a child, student, or apprentice of some kind. We also see ideas common to the Hellenistic philosophical traditions, including Neoplatonism and Gnosticism. For instance, in the previous quote from the Pymander, we find not only the Greek word nous used for mind in the source material, but also the overarching idea specifically of a divine mind as progenitor of creation, and an aspect of an ultimately transcendent one. Another quintessential Hermetic text, no pun intended, is the Emerald Tablet. Though this short treatise is one of the most central pieces of Hermetic literature, it is not included within the Corpus Hermeticum, but comes to us from medieval Arabic sources, the oldest of which dates back to the 9th century CE, where it appears as an appendix to an alchemical treatise entitled the Kitab Sir al-Halika, or Book of the Secret of Creation. Known in Latin as the Tabula Smaragdina, this work was held as foundational to the art of alchemy in both the Islamic and European alchemical traditions. It is from this work which we extract the famous Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. Like much of the Hermetic literature, the Emerald Tablet deals with the cosmology and esoteric science in obscure and abstract terms. We'll be venturing much deeper into these texts and others in the second part of this series, but it is at this point worth mentioning a few of the texts which fall under the classification of the Technical Hermetica. Again, the Technical Hermetica are texts which contain the practical application of Hermetic philosophies as expounded in the Philosophical Hermetica. These are the PGM, or Papyri Greco-Magicae, an academic classification of a group of texts found within what is commonly called the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri. This collection of texts contains spells, hymns, liturgies, and rituals from the Greco-Egyptian or Hellenistic tradition dating from the 1st century BCE to the 5th century CE. Another is the Sacred Book of Hermes to Asclepios, a manual on the use of amulets against disease, utilizing the decans of the Greco-Egyptian zodiac. The Egyptian astrological system utilized 36 stars, which divided the ecliptic into 36 segments of 10 degrees. The Greek zodiac was typified by many of the zodiacal signs which are familiar to us today. During this period of Hellenistic syncretization, the modern zodiac as we know it was formulated from the combination of these two elements. The last text in the Technical Hermetica, which I'll mention for the sake of example, is the well-known treatise on astrological magic, the Picatrix, a comprehensive collation of astrological, magical, and talismanic techniques entitled in its original Arabic Gayat al-Hakim, or the Goal of the Sage. The full corpus of the Technical Hermetica is at this point not as well fleshed out as a whole as the Philosophical Hermetica, from an academic standpoint at least. This is largely due to the difficulty in organizing these texts for formal study and examination, as well as a predisposition over the past several hundred years in academia to completely dismiss actual practical magic as superstition and primitive mumbo-jumbo. So at this point it becomes clear that quite a few of the more significant texts were not only written in Koine Greek, Coptic, and Demotic, but in Arabic as well. With the gradual increase of Roman-sanctioned Christianity after the empire's official conversion in 314, followed by the anti-pagan edicts of Emperor Theodosius I and the subsequent collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the sacred literature of the Hellenistic traditions, including Hermetism, were all but lost to Europe during the Middle Ages. However, much of the Neoplatonic, alchemical, and Hermetic literature was preserved by the Perso-Arabic cultures of this time. While many extant Hermetic works to this day are preserved in the Arabic language, a significant amount have not yet been released into widespread publication or translated, narrowing accessibility to modern scholars and practitioners. For this reason as well, it becomes difficult to pinpoint exactly what is attributable to the ancient Hellenistic sources and how much was innovation. Again, we do find in texts such as the Carmen Astrologicum, originally written in Greek by Dorotheus of Sidon, but lost and now preserved in Arabic, a strong astrological component to much of the Perso-Arabic Hermetica. However, as mentioned earlier and elaborated in an alchemical series on this channel, there was also a significant body of alchemical literature which was preserved and bolstered during the Perso-Arabic textual diaspora. Despite gradual Christian ascendancy throughout medieval Europe, there is suggestive evidence that the Grimoire traditions, which come to us from this and later periods, and largely established within a Judeo-Christian, dare I say, clerical framework, were heavily influenced by the Hellenistic magic of late antiquity, as they possess core features which closely resemble spells, evocations, and consecrations within technical Hermetic texts, such as the PGM. The legend of Hermes Trismegistus persisted, and his works and philosophy, albeit textually unfamiliar to European scholars of the time period, were indeed highly revered. At the very beginnings of what would become the Greater Italian Renaissance stands a 15th century Florentine merchant. No ordinary peddler of goods and wares, Cosimo de' Medici, the Pater Patriae, father of the country, used wealth inherited from his father, himself a successful banker, to found his own Medici Bank in Florence. Eventually, Cosimo rose to the height of the political hierarchy and found himself at the very peak of Florentine government and commerce. Yet, he was a man of profound insight, culture, and learning. It was at the behest of Cosimo, and by way of his vast resources, that the Hermetic, Platonic, and Neoplatonic texts were brought back to Europe. Yet Cosimo, cultured man as he was, did not possess the ability to translate these from the archaic and foreign languages in which they had been preserved. A true patron of learning, Cosimo took under his wing a young man with a peculiar genius for language and philosophy, Marsilio Ficino. Upon acquiring these legendary texts from a network of monks hired to scour monasteries and sacred libraries throughout Europe, Cosimo sought the talents of young Ficino in translating them into the lingua franca of their day, Latin, which Ficino of necessity obliged to an incredibly prolific degree. A famous story of the finding of the long-lost Corpus Hermeticum tells of Cosimo interrupting Ficino's translation of the Platonic corpus and admonishing him to reprioritize the Hermetic literature as foremost. What ensued was a rebirth, a renaissance. Like Zosimos before him, Ficino became a nexus point for the synthesis and reemergence of the Hellenistic spirit of genius of late antiquity, which was as a renovating fire to the European world of his time. Ficino himself was made the head of a new Platonic academy by Cosimo de' Medici, and wrote his 3 books on life, which, from his translations of the Platonic, Neoplatonic, and Hermetic philosophy, clearly expounded a system of magic, which was elaborated in the northern regions of Europe by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who relied heavily on Ficino's work for his own 3 books of occult philosophy, and which was also further informed by Ficino's translations of the Corpus Hermeticum. This would become Renaissance Hermeticism, or Hermeticism generally, as opposed to the Hermetism of late antiquity. Ficino, clearly influenced or perhaps informed by profound immersion into several of the dominant formerly lost philosophies of late antiquity, coined the term Prisca Theologia, or ancient theology. This term denotes the existence of a single underlying spiritual truth existing since time immemorial, imparted by God himself to mankind and residing at the esoteric core of all religions. This idea itself is inherently Hermetic, as the Hermetic literature itself constantly refers to an underlying unity, which manifests as multiplicity, and which may be contacted by humans with a specific knowledge and artful application of universal principles, which are themselves patterns, the brushstrokes of creative deity, that when observed and meticulously traced, may lead us back to the unity of God. Hermetism had early on espoused the concept of a quote-unquote hidden or secret wisdom, which Hermes famously carved into his pillars, which were then hidden in anticipation of a coming great flood. Ficino and his associate, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, endeavored a reformation of Christian doctrine around this time along Neoplatonic and expressly Hermetic lines of philosophy. Pico attached himself to the version of Hebrew mysticism known as the Kabbalah, and using the very Hermetic strain of thought of the Psychotheologia, essentially created, along with other scholars of his time inspired by a similar impetus, the Christian Kabbalah. We covered this in some detail in our series on the magical Kabbalah. Ficino was not the only translator of Hermetic texts, however. Italian poet and philosopher Ludovico Lazzarelli rendered a translation of the Corpus Hermeticum which expanded upon Ficino's earlier work. The Stobaean extracts mentioned earlier were translated and edited in Antwerp in the mid-1500s by Dutch classical scholar Wilhelm Cantor. The Swiss physician Paracelsus based his Spagyria on a medical philosophy drawing directly from Hermetic principles expounded in both the Philosophical and Technical Hermetica. His work is further thought to have influenced the thought of German Christian mystic, philosopher, and cobbler, that is, shoemaker, Jacob Böhme, or Jacob Boehme. Hermes had returned. The restoration and synthesis of Hermetic literature and the broader Hellenistic traditions to European literati and intellectuals of this era was significant. During the subsequent Enlightenment period, many of these texts did become increasingly ignored. However, during the 19th century, when the Hermetic impulse began to bubble up once more in the peripheries of the collective awareness, these texts were readily available for serious study. This came full circle with the 18th and 19th century Egyptomania in the West, sparked by Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. French troops retrieved the Rosetta Stone in 1799, and in 1822, Jean-François Champollion successfully translated Egyptian hieroglyphs by aid of the Rosetta Stone. Archaeology, literature, art, fashion, politics, the very fabric of society itself in the West was completely renovated by this renewed interest in ancient Egyptian history, culture, and religion. We see remnants of this in the mass of obelisks scattered all over as monuments throughout our country. The entire Art Deco movement was influenced by Egyptian art, architecture, fashion, and design. We find Hermetic literature being expounded and explored in the theosophical literature of Helena Blavatsky. Hermes Trismegistus is the name of Hermes or Thoth in his human aspect. As a god, he is far more than this. When he has the head of an ibis, he is the sacred scribe of the gods. But even then he wears the crown Atef and the lunar disk. He is the most mysterious of gods. As a serpent, Hermes Thoth is the divine creative wisdom. We find a prototype of a modern Hermetic magical society in the Hermetic Society of Anna Bonus Kingsford, which, along with the Theosophical Society, would heavily influence and set the stage for the emergence of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in fin de siècle England. The Theosophist George Robert Stowe Mead translated and published the Corpus Hermeticum into English, as well as a massive 3-volume work entitled Thrice Greatest Hermes. William Wynne Westcott, Freemason, Rosicrucian, and founding member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, also published his Collectanea Hermetica in 10 volumes, containing translations of works within the Hermetica, Hebrew Kabbalah, classical Roman literature, alchemical texts, the Chaldean oracles, and Neo-Pythagorean numeral. The work of Giuliano Cremers is also significant in our study. Cremers, born Ciro Forbisano, was an Italian philosopher who came into contact with the Italic initiatory traditions, which were purported to have existed in the region since the time of Pythagoras' school at Crotona on the southeastern coast of Italy. Though how true this is cannot be accurately gauged, as these society were, of necessity, secret. Cremers wrote extensively on the Italic Hermetic tradition, most exemplary perhaps in his work, The Hermetic Science of Transformation. He also focused on a species of energetic healing modalities. He espoused a philosophy of what he called sacred materialism, which was based on the ultimate unity underlying all things. To zoom in a bit on some of the personages we just mentioned, we find a curious character in the late Anna Bonus Kingsford. Born in 1846, Kingsford was a staunch anti-vivisectionist. She opposed the early scientific movement and the rise of scientism for its use of animals for purposes of experimentation, which was often extremely callous and cruel. She went so far at one point as to attempt to assassinate her arch-rival, prominent scientist Louis Pasteur, by means of psychic attack. However, her plans were foiled. Kingsford joined the Theosophical Society in 1883 and founded her own organization, the Hermetic Society, 1 year later. She was attested by others to be a trance psychic, and her work while in trance was collected by her then partner Edward Maitland and published after her death of pneumonia in a work entitled Clothed with the Sun. Kingsford's most significant contribution to the forward momentum of Hermeticism perhaps was in the cultivation of one of her most adoring and dedicated students, Samuel Liddell Mathers. Mathers would go on to become one of the 3 founding members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, along with William Wynne Westcott and William Robert Woodman. Westcott and Mathers as a team worked to completely transform and transmit Hermetic teachings in their rituals, curriculum, philosophies, lectures, translations, books, and papers, both within their Golden Dawn community and the broader spiritual and Masonic communities. They embraced a Hermetic application and underpinning to all things magical and mystical, essentially creating the Hermetic Kabbalah with their grafting of tarot, elemental, and astrological correspondences to the Hebrew Kabbalistic tree of life. The tarot at that time was purported to be of Egyptian descent. Florence Farr, famous actress and Golden Dawn initiate, while perusing the London Museum one day, was confessedly contacted by what she described as an Egyptian adept. This Egyptian adept gave her secret teachings on Egyptian magic. Her works on this subject were included in Westcott's Collectanea Hermetica. So why were her works and other works such as the Somnium Scipionis and Kabbalistic treatises such as the Sefer Yetzirah included in the Collectanea Hermetica and Hermeticism of his day and age? After Ficino's translations, but more especially around the end of the 1800s, Hermeticism was distinct from Hermetism, at least when we examine it retrospectively. With the reemergence of ancient texts and philosophies, there are always periods of interpretation and innovation. The Hermeticism of Ficino's day, as say in the Italic Hermetic traditions, was markedly different from the more distinct separation of Hermetism and other schools of thought in Egypt of late antiquity, because it was then a living tradition. Ficino's worldview was also tinctured by his idea of the Prisca Theologia, which was to be found at the heart of all traditions, thereby uniting them despite outward appearances. By the time of Westcott and others, Hermeticism was a bracket term, denoting things pertaining to magic and Egypt of late antiquity. We also see by way of theologians such as Pico della Mirandola and other Christian Kabbalists, like the German Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, a conflation of early Hebrew and Egyptian cultures. We understand historically, even in the modern day, that the two were in very close proximity and contact with one another. However, Kircher believed that the cross-pollination of the two cultures was so thorough, he went on to write in his Oedipus Egypticus, quote, "The Hebrews have such an affinity to the rites, sacrifices, ceremonies, and sacred disciplines of the Egyptians that I am fully persuaded that either the Egyptians were Hebraicizing or the Hebrews were Egypticizing." Ultimately, the application of Hermeticism to all things mystico-magical was a product of many things. However, we find that even in such works as the Dream of Scipio, or Somnium Scipionis, a work written by Roman orator Marcus Tullius Cicero, or Cicero, is there a Platonic and Neoplatonic cosmology so firmly espoused and delineated, being in this instance culled directly from Plato's Myth of in Book 10 of the Republic, which we covered in depth in a standalone episode on this channel, that it is fair to include it and writings of a similar nature and cosmology under the banner of Hermeticism generally. That is because these works are of use to us on a practitioner basis, rather than merely historical categorization and study. In this way, thanks to organizations such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Hermeticism is also a living, practicable tradition today. We can consider the works of Hermeticism as being inspired by the earlier Hermetic writings of Hermetism. However, the distinction between Hermetism and Hermeticism is useful to distinguish whether one is working within the academic or living Hermetic tradition of today. I want to speak briefly about a notable offshoot work of the modern day, that is, 20th century Hermetic literature, the Kybalion, whose authorship was attributed in anonymity to 3 initiates, but thought to have been written at least by William Walker Atkinson, if not also by Paul Foster Case, and one other initiate, as is alleged by some, claims to delineate 7 Hermetic principles. These principles, while valid from a practitioner basis at an entry level, are not necessarily Hermetic. The issue here is at the heart of the Hermetism Hermeticism distinction. As a set of traditional doctrines, passed through time and lineage. No, the Kybalion is not Hermetic. As literature in the vein of modern Hermeticism, which is inspired by the academic Hermetism and derivative philosophies, and which is also constantly shifting and changing to either include or exclude some or other text, doctrine, or practice, perhaps. Just as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn participated in. As something strictly Hermetic, unequivocally no. A similar charge could be leveled against Barden's initiation into Hermetics. A lot of this stems from a lack of historical context regarding Hermetism and the Hermetic literature in general, in a time when the term Hermetic was being proliferated to denote a kind of mystico-magical connotation. Dan Atrell has done a wonderful job delineating the points for and against the Kybalion as Hermetic on his channel, The Modern Hermeticist, and I've included a link to that specific video in the section below this video. I also recommend David Pantano's book, The Magic Door, a study on the Italic Hermetic tradition, for more insight and exquisite information on Hermeticism from Roman times to the present day. In the next episode of this series, we'll take a look at some of the Hermetic literature itself, explore Hermetic philosophy, and examine how it was applied magically via the Technical Hermetica in both Renaissance and modern Hermeticism. So, are you a Hermetist or a Hermeticist? Was there any era or personage of relevance to the Hermetic tradition that I left out? Which text would you like to see explored in the next episode? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. If you've enjoyed this content, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Arcanum Patreon. For the cost of a cup of coffee per month or a one-time donation, you can help me continue to produce free, rigorously researched and practiced material like this. Patreon members also have access to bonus content, including episode addendums and my Egypt travel vlog, as well as other goodies. Please continue to watch, like, comment, and share if you're not in the position to contribute financially. There are always plenty of ways to help me keep the Arcanum channel alive and well. Join me again in the next episode where we'll dive deeper into the history, theory, and practice of this and many other related topics. Thanks for watching. In Luke's.